Welcome everyone. In this new series of video, we will see why anyone in the world knows this symbol. How, thanks to the dollar, the United States have managed to establish an influence and build an incomparable balance of power on the world, uncontested for more than half a century. Why the events we are witnessing today in Europe could be a turning point in world trade, possibly leading to a new economic and geostrategic model. And why those could even be the dawn of an alternative global balance of power. First, a very brief reminder on how the global trade operates. Buckle up. Let's see what happens when two countries trade with each other. If over a year, Japan exports to the US more than it imports from the US, then it would have a trade surplus. Japan would be creditor. If it imports from the US more than it exports to the US, it would have a trade deficit. Japan would be debtor.
Historically, that is until 1944, those debts are all settled in gold.
For sure, it never happens that one country imports from another exactly as much as it exports to. It may be that from one year to another, or over course of a few years, Japan and the US would successively shift from deficit to surplus and vice versa, but, in the mid or long term, have their respective flow of imports roughly equal to that of exports. In this case, gold would successively pass from the US to Japan and from Japan to the US. Here, everything's fine and everyone's happy. At the end, the trade is balanced. When a country constantly and continuously imports more than it exports, then such country would have a structural deficit. Its reserves of gold would go lower and lower every year until they are empty, and then it would find no country to trade with, until it improves and redresses its trade balance. Today, the US dollar replaced the gold in the international trades, which means that all international transactions are settled in US dollars. Could make sense if the US are one of those two countries. Possibly makes sense when the countries in question are close to the US. But what when the US have nothing to do with the countries involved?
How did that happen? It all started in 1944. Towards the end of the World War II, the Allied nations decided to put in place a new financial system known as the Bretton Woods Agreements. Under this system, the US would keep the majority of the gold reserves, which was the money accepted worldwide at that time. The rest of the world would trade, using dollar in replacement of gold. Why the dollar?
Because at that time, the US represent more than half of the world's GDP and own nearly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. At end of World War II, the US have an indisputable and undisputed position. They are the leaders of the world. So the dollar effectively replaces gold. Crucial detail, at that point, the dollar was convertible into gold on simple request, at a fixed exchange rate of $35 an ounce. The world moved from a system strictly based on gold, to a gold standard system. It had been agreed that the US would have the responsibility of always maintaining enough gold in their vaults to secure the buyback of dollars and had to adjust the supply of dollars to maintain confidence in future gold convertibility. In other words, the dollar bills are true certificates of ownership for real gold stored in the US Federal Reserves. All the countries felt comfortable starting to save and trade with the dollar, as they considered their dollars were backed by gold. Everyone trusted and traded with the dollar, which placed the US in an extremely advantageous position. In the 1960s, Giscard d'Estaing, then the French Minister of Finance, called that America's exorbitant privilege. The economist Eichengreen points that it costs only a few cents for the US to produce a $100 bill, while the other countries had to give up $100 of actual goods in order to obtain one of those bills. The Bretton Woods system goes on for nearly 30 years. Until what was called the Nixon shock. In 1971, President Nixon decrees a series of drastic measures, meant to remedy the increasing inflation. One of those measures is a suspension of the Bretton Woods agreements. The U.S. unilaterally canceled the direct convertibility of dollars to gold. A few-word sentence but carrying some of the world's greatest effects for the following decades and until today.
Why the Nixon shock in 1971? In the 60s, the U.S. are in the middle of a non-ending Vietnam War and with continuously increasing social expenditures of the government. The U.S. were suffering from a growing public debt, a negative balance of payments and a monetary inflation causing a great depreciation of the dollar. To finance a costly war and the social measures, the U.S. started a money printing race. However, as long as the dollar was convertible into gold on a simple request, the U.S. could not keep printing it without an equivalent increase of the gold reserves, as it was against the Bretton Woods agreements. Gold being a limited resource, the national reserves were restricted by a natural constraint and the U.S. were at constant risk of finding themselves unable to honor their obligations of supplying gold to the countries expressing a request to convert their dollars into gold. That would have caused the U.S. to be in default and the whole Bretton Woods system to fail.
For a certain time, all the countries continued exporting goods and providing services to the U.S. and in exchange, they were paid with dollars not backed by gold but dollars created based on nothing. The money printing race started slowly at first and grew throughout the 60s. But, what if the newly printed money does not come into circulation in the country in question but in another country? Since there was a huge demand for dollars around the world, the U.S. did not experience an inflation as severe as it should have been. One can imagine that inflation is not a big problem for the printing country because it somehow exports its inflation to other countries. That is exactly what happened. The U.S. began to silently print more and more dollars to buy from the other countries goods and services that were certainly real. In the early 70s, a few countries began to understand what the U.S. were doing. They realized there were more dollars in circulation than gold held by the U.S. and that if all main members of the Bretton Woods system decided to claim their gold from the Fed with their dollars, there wouldn't be enough gold for the number of dollars in circulation. France and Switzerland started lining up selling large volumes of dollars for gold. What started out as a few gold buybacks at the Fed has promptly accelerated. If more countries realized that the dollar was no longer as good as gold, they would stop holding it as a reserve currency. The global financial influence of the U.S. would take a serious turn. Something had to be done and done urgently. Hence, Richard Nixon's announcement of 1971 that the U.S. would no longer convert dollars into gold. To continue the money printing race, the U.S. had to break the link that used to exist between the volume of dollars available and the amount of gold in the Federal Reserve.
The dollar was no longer bearing any relation to gold. What this actually meant is that before 1971, any country with dollars in its reserves had a guarantee that upon a simple request, the U.S. government would supply the counterpart amount of gold for those dollars. And remember the historical importance of gold in the international trade. After 1971, countries with dollars in their reserves had, no longer a guarantee from the U.S. government, but a promise that there would always be countries lining up to accept those green papers in exchange of actual goods it would supply. One needs to understand that back then, the dollar notes actually carried a mention stating, in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. Thus, bearers of dollars could actually walk in at a bank and ask for the equivalent quantity of gold against their dollar notes. Foreign countries that held dollars could no longer legally claim their gold, while the U.S. could print currency without fear of losing the gold reserves in their vaults. Since the dollars under the Bretton Woods system were actual certificates of ownership of actual gold in the Federal Reserve vaults, the unilateral decision of the U.S. constituted a major default of the U.S. to its international obligations.
As the dollar was no longer backed by gold, the value of the dollar began to collapse. By end of 1972, price of gold had doubled from $35 to $70 an ounce, meaning that the value of the dollar was divided by 2 over just 1 year. With the value of the dollar plummeting, prices have been steadily rising around the world and confidence in the dollar started to be questioned. However, when the U.S. have unilaterally decided to suspend the Bretton Woods system in 1971, the dollar, still remained the undisputed reference, because the US had strong arguments. 1. The US had big battleships. 2. The US still had an economy of first rank, making it possible to keep confidence in the stability of the dollar, at long term. 3. The US had noisy fighter jets parked on big battleships. 4. The US are a country of freedom that inspires confidence. 5. The US have a powerful army and in fact, the only one able to compete with the communist power, still scary at the time.
The recipe for a king dollar since 1971 is therefore a mixture of unspoken threats and incentives. But that wasn't enough for the US to retain the privilege granted by the world to print its money in exchange of real goods and services for the previous 30 years. At that point, the US risked having this privilege withdrawn with painful consequences. The stakes are too high. The US have spent too much on wars and social initiatives. Investors began to reduce their loans and investments. The signs pointed to a hyperinflationary spiral, and the US desperately needed to find ways to keep the world using their currency. For the US, the mere thought of losing the privilege they had is simply intolerable.
And here's when come the petrodollars. As usual, subscribe, like, and share the video to help me develop this channel.